The wind rolled over the open plains, carrying dust and the faint smell of rain as a young woman approached the weathered gates of Ridge Hollow Ranch. Her name was Clara Whitmore, though few knew it then. Her dress was faded, her boots scuffed, and her hands clutched a small bundle of belongings wrapped in cloth. Every step she took toward the ranch was uncertain, each one a quiet prayer that this time someone might let her stay. Inside the main house, Luke Barrett, the widowed rancher, was at his desk sorting through invoices when he heard a timid knock at the door. When he opened it, he found Clara standing there, thin, pale, and trembling slightly from exhaustion. Her voice was soft but steady as she said, "I heard you might need help in the kitchen, sir." Luke studied her for a long moment. She looked too young to have lines of weariness around her eyes, and yet something about her posture, head bowed, shoulders tight, spoke of years heavier than her age. He wasn't one to take strangers in easily, especially not since his wife Anna had passed 3 winters ago. But there was something in Clara's eyes, a haunted gentleness that stirred his quiet conscience. He cleared his throat and nodded toward the kitchen. "You can start tomorrow," he said. "Meals at 6 and noon, supper at sundown. My boy eats early." Clara's lips parted slightly in surprise. "You're hiring me?" "I need a cook," he replied simply. "And you look like you could use the work." It wasn't much of an introduction, but to Clara, it felt like mercy. The next morning, she rose before dawn. She scrubbed her hands clean, tied her hair back, and stepped into the kitchen, a space large enough for a family she didn't have. Dust lay thick on the windowsills, and the old iron stove groaned when she opened its door. She found flour in the pantry, beans in a jar, a few eggs, and a small hunk of salted pork. It wasn't much, but she worked quietly and skillfully, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. By the time the ranch hands came in for breakfast, the air was filled with the smell of cornbread and coffee. They looked at her curiously, whispering to one another. Some smiled kindly, others just nodded. Clara kept her eyes on the plates, moving silently among them, careful not to draw attention. Luke entered last, his tall frame filling the doorway. He paused for a moment, watching her serve his men. She didn't look up. When she set his plate down in front of him, her hands were steady, but he noticed how she avoided even the briefest glance his way. "Thank you." "Ma'am," he said quietly. She murmured, "You're welcome." "Sir?" Her voice barely more than a whisper. For days, the pattern stayed the same. She cooked, cleaned, and kept to herself. The men grew used to her quiet presence, though now and then one of them would make a remark about her being a skittish thing. Luke silenced such talk with a single look. He didn't know her story, but he knew what it meant for someone to carry grief behind their eyes. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields turned gold, Luke stood on the porch, watching Clara gather herbs from the garden. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as though she feared breaking something fragile, perhaps herself. For a moment, he almost called out to her, to ask if she was settling in. But the words caught in his throat. He wasn't ready to talk about his own loneliness either. That night, as Clara lay in the small room off the kitchen, she stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of horses in the barn. For the first time in months, she wasn't sleeping under the open sky. The bed was rough but warm. Her hands ached, her heart heavier still. Yet beneath the weight of her sorrow, a small ember of something she'd thought long dead flickered faintly to life. Hope. She didn't know it yet. But this quiet ranch and the man who'd given her a chance without asking questions would soon change everything. The first week at Ridge Hollow Ranch passed in near silence. Every morning, Clara rose before dawn, the stars still bright above the plains, and made her way to the kitchen. Her movements were quiet, careful, almost invisible. She prepared biscuits and coffee for the ranch hands, then went about tidying the large, drafty house. By the time Luke Barrett came in for breakfast, the table was set, the fire stoked, and Clara had already retreated to the far side of the room. Luke wasn't used to having anyone else in his home. Since his wife Anna's passing 3 years earlier, the ranch had been kept in working order, but the house itself had gone still, too tidy, too quiet. Clara's presence brought faint traces of life back to it, though she herself was as silent as a shadow. She never lingered near the table when the men ate, and she never joined in their laughter. Instead, she stood by the stove, wiping her hands on her apron, as though waiting to be told she could disappear. At first, Luke thought she was simply shy. But after a few days, he began to notice little things, the way she flinched at sudden noises, how she tensed whenever a man raised his voice, even in harmless jest. Once one of the ranch hands dropped a pan, and Clara went pale, gripping the edge of the counter as though bracing for something that didn't come. She worked with quiet determination. But her silence was not peace, it was armor. Luke wasn't a man given to meddling in another's troubles, yet he couldn't ignore the unease that stirred whenever he saw the distant look in her eyes. He had known pain too, the hollow ache that came from losing someone you loved and not knowing how to fill the empty rooms they left behind. His grief had made him hard, practical. But seeing Clara move through the kitchen like a ghost of herself made him remember the part of him that used to care too deeply. Each day, Clara expanded her duties without being asked. She mended torn shirts, polished the brass lamps, and kept the hearth swept clean. The ranch hands began to leave small tokens of gratitude, a bag of flour, a jar of honey, once even a wildflower left on the counter. She accepted each gift with a nod, but never smiled. In the evenings, Luke often found himself watching her from the doorway as she worked. Her hands were quick, practiced, the kind of skill that came from years of doing without rest. Once, when the light caught her wrist just right, he saw a faint white scar running across it, half hidden beneath her sleeve. He looked away quickly, ashamed of his curiosity. Whatever her story was, it wasn't his place to ask. Not yet. The ranch's routine began to shift around her quiet presence. Meals were warmer, the men more content. Luke's young son Eli had taken to sitting near the kitchen table while Clara cooked, sketching on scraps of paper. She didn't talk to him much, but once Luke overheard her whisper, "You draw beautifully," and the boy had beamed as though she'd given him the world. That night, Luke lay awake thinking about that small exchange. It was the first time he'd heard her voice hold something softer than caution. It reminded him of the way his late wife used to speak, gentle, patient, kind. He wondered what kind of life Clara had come from to make such tenderness seem like a risk. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, rattling the windows. Inside, the faint clatter of dishes told Luke that Clara was still awake, working long after the rest had gone to bed. He thought about telling her she didn't have to do so much, that she was safe here. But when he rose to go downstairs, he stopped himself. She wasn't ready to hear those words yet, and so for now he let the quiet remain between them, unspoken but not empty. It was a silence that waited, patient as the land itself, for the day when one of them would finally find the courage to break it. The first real storm of spring came without warning. By midday, dark clouds rolled across the open sky, turning the golden fields of Ridge Hollow Ranch to shadow. The air grew heavy and restless. Clara stood by the kitchen window, her hands plunged in a basin of soapy water, watching the horizon darken. She'd always hated storms. They reminded her of shouting, of doors slammed too hard, of nights when thunder had not come from the sky but from the man she once called husband. When the first rumble echoed over the land, she flinched so sharply that a plate slipped from her hand and shattered in the sink. She closed her eyes, forcing her breath to steady. It's just weather, she told herself. Nothing else. Outside, Luke Barrett and his ranch hands were hurrying to bring in the horses before the rain hit. The wind tore across the yard, kicking up dust and dry leaves. Luke caught sight of Clara through the kitchen window, her face pale, her shoulders rigid. Something in her stillness struck him like a memory of loss, though he couldn't name why. Minutes later, the rain began in earnest. The men ran for cover, shouting over the wind. But Clara, instead of staying inside, had rushed out to gather the wash she'd hung earlier that morning. White sheets flapped violently on the line as thunder cracked overhead. She gripped one end of the rope, trying to pull it down before the storm ruined everything. From the barn, Luke saw her struggling, her small figure dwarfed by the angry sky. He dropped the reins he was holding and ran toward her, his boots splashing through the mud. "Clara," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "Leave it. It's just laundry!" But she didn't seem to hear him. The thunder rolled again, louder this time, and she froze completely, her eyes wide with terror. For a heartbeat, she wasn't on the ranch anymore. She was back in a dark room where shouts turned into blows. Luke reached her just as the rain began to pour in sheets. He took hold of her wrist gently but firmly. "It's all right," he said, his voice steady despite the storm. "Come on, let's get inside." Clara blinked, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The sound of his voice seemed to pull her back to the present. She let him guide her toward the porch, her fingers still clutching a half-wet bedsheet. Once inside, Luke handed her a towel. "You're soaked through," he said. She stood there shivering, unable to meet his eyes. When he took the sheet from her trembling hands, she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean I should have finished before... Clara." His tone was soft but firm. "You don't have to apologize for a storm." Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. He waited for her to speak, but when she didn't, he gave a small nod and stepped back. "There's a fire going in the parlor. Warm yourself up." She hesitated, as if the invitation were too kind to trust. But after a moment she obeyed. She sat near the hearth, her wet hair clinging to her neck, her hands folded in her lap. The firelight caught the faint scars on her wrist again, and Luke felt a tightness in his chest. Whoever had hurt her, it had left marks deeper than skin. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sounds were the rain on the roof and the soft hiss of the fire. Then, just before he left the room, Luke said quietly, "You don't have to be afraid here." He didn't wait for a response. But when he turned to go, he caught a glimpse of something on her face. Something small, but unmistakable. The beginning of tears. Later that night, when the storm had passed and the house lay silent, Clara sat awake long after the fire had died down. His words replayed in her mind again and again. "You don't have to be afraid here." No one had ever said that to her before, and for the first time in years, she wanted to believe it. Morning came quietly after the storm, leaving the air washed clean and cool. The ranch was peaceful again, dew sparkling on the grass, birds returning to the fence posts. But inside the house, Clara felt as though something inside her had cracked open and refused to close. She had barely slept. Every time she shut her eyes, she saw lightning flash across the sky, felt the thunder in her chest, heard Luke's voice calling her name through the wind. And then, his words afterward, gentle but steady. "You don't have to be afraid here." Those words had followed her into her dreams. Soft and impossible to forget, by dawn, she was already in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, hands busy kneading dough for the morning biscuits. The familiar rhythm of work had always been her refuge. Cooking gave her something to control, something to fix. If her hands stayed busy, her mind couldn't wander to the places she'd tried to bury. But today, as she stirred the pot of gravy, her fingers began to tremble. The scent of coffee filled the room, the fire crackled warmly, and still, her chest ached as though something deep inside her had broken loose. Luke came in quietly, as he often did, his boots brushing the wooden floor with soft, measured steps. He wasn't expecting much conversation. Clara rarely spoke beyond "yes, sir," and "no, sir." But this morning, something felt different. He noticed the way her shoulders were drawn tight, the way she kept turning her face slightly away from him. "Smells good in here," he said, his voice low. She nodded without looking up. "Breakfast will be ready soon." He poured himself a cup of coffee, but his eyes lingered on her. "You were up early," he remarked. "Yes, sir." She turned her back to him, pretending to check the oven. He saw her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand, quick and desperate, as though she could erase the evidence of tears before he noticed. But he did notice. "Clara," he said softly. Her hands froze on the oven handle. "Look at me," he continued gently. She turned halfway, her chin trembling. Her eyes were bright with tears she could no longer hide. "I'm sorry," she whispered hoarsely. "I don't mean to be like this. I'll work harder, I promise. I just..." Luke set his cup down on the table and crossed the room slowly, careful not to startle her. "You don't have to be sorry for crying." The words came out quiet, almost reverent. Her lips parted, confusion flickering across her face, as though she didn't understand the language he was speaking. "But it's foolish. Crying won't fix anything." "No," he said, "but holding it in can break you worse." For a moment the only sound was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Clara's tears slipped silently down her cheeks, darkening the fabric of her apron. She tried to turn away again, but Luke spoke once more, his voice a steady anchor. "You've been through something," he said. "I don't need to know what. Not unless you want to tell me. But you don't have to hide it here. Not from me, that did it." The dam she'd held for so long gave way. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth as quiet sobs escaped her, years of fear and shame pouring out in broken gasps. Luke didn't move closer, didn't reach out. He simply stood near, a calm presence, letting her grieve without judgment. When at last her crying slowed, she wiped her eyes and gave a small, apologetic laugh through her tears. "I must look a fright," he smiled faintly. "You look human, that's all." Something fragile and warm flickered in her chest then. Something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just safety. It was trust. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Ridge Hollow Ranch, Clara felt seen, not as a servant, not as a runaway, but as a person whose pain didn't make her unworthy of kindness. As Luke left the kitchen to tend to the morning chores, she turned back to the stove. Her hands were still unsteady, but her heart felt lighter. The rancher's gentle words had broken her silence, and perhaps begun to heal it too. For days after that morning in the kitchen, something between Luke and Clara quietly changed. It wasn't spoken of. They didn't mention the tears or the conversation that followed. But it lingered like a soft current beneath every glance and every word. The silence between them no longer felt heavy or awkward. It had become something gentler, almost comforting. Clara moved through her days as before, cooking, mending, scrubbing, tending the little herb garden behind the house. But now there was a new steadiness in her movements. She no longer flinched at Luke's voice or the sound of boots on the porch. When he entered the room, she no longer shrank back. She still rarely met his eyes, but when she did, the fear in them was slowly giving way to something else, trust. One quiet evening, as the sun slipped low and the ranch hands finished their supper, Luke lingered in the kitchen while Clara washed the dishes. The room smelled of bread and wood smoke. Outside, frogs had begun their nightly chorus by the creek. Luke leaned against the doorway, watching her work in silence for a while before he finally spoke. "You work too hard," he said. She didn't turn. "Work keeps me steady." "Steady's good," he replied, "but rest does a person good too." Her hands paused in the dishwater. "Rest," she repeated softly, as though it were a foreign word. "I wouldn't know what to do with myself." Luke gave a quiet laugh, rough and low. "You'd figure it out." For a long moment, only the water's quiet splash filled the room. Then, as if drawn by something she could no longer hold back, Clara said, "You asked me before what I'd been through. I think maybe I need to tell you." He straightened, not wanting to startle her. "Only if you want to." Clara nodded, still facing the window. "My husband was a blacksmith," she began slowly. "Strong hands. A hard man. When I first married him, I thought I'd done something good, found a home, a future. But it didn't take long before he started drinking. And when he drank, everything turned mean. The shouting came first, then." She hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of the sink. "Then the bruises." Luke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He could hear the tremor in her voice, the shame that didn't belong to her, but had been planted there all the same. "I stayed for years," she went on, "because I was afraid to leave and because folks told me it was my duty to endure it. A wife obeys. That's what I believed." She drew in a shaky breath. "He died 6 months ago. A fight at a saloon. I didn't cry. I just packed what little I had and walked until my feet bled. I told myself I was free, but I didn't feel it. Not until I came here." She finally turned then, her face pale in the lamplight, her eyes searching his. "You've been kinder to me than anyone has in a long time, Mr. Barrett. I don't know why." Luke met her gaze, steady and sure. "Because kindness doesn't cost a man anything, and you look like you've paid enough." The words hit her like warmth after winter. Her throat tightened, tears threatening again, but this time she didn't hide them. Luke cleared his throat softly, looking down at his hands. "I lost someone too," he said after a pause. "My wife Anna, 3 years now. I thought if I stayed busy I wouldn't feel the ache so much. Turns out work don't fix a lonely heart either." They stood there for a long moment, neither speaking, the silence between them full of understanding. Then Luke said, his voice quiet, "You don't have to thank me. Clara, you're safe here. That's enough for me." Her lip trembled, but she smiled. A small, fragile thing that reached her eyes. That night, as Luke stepped out onto the porch and looked toward the glowing kitchen window, he saw her there, moving gently, humming under her breath. For the first time since Anna's passing, the sound made the house feel like a home again, and inside, Clara felt something she hadn't dared to hope for, the first fragile stirrings of peace. The weeks that followed brought a quiet, steady change to Ridge Hollow Ranch. The land began to bloom again, wildflowers pushing through the grass, the air thick with the scent of sage after each rainfall. But it wasn't just the earth that was softening. Inside the old ranch house, Clara was beginning to heal in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her laughter came first, small and hesitant, like the first bird song before dawn. Eli, Luke's 8-year-old son, had been the one to draw it out of her. He'd taken to sitting at the kitchen table every afternoon, sketching horses, clouds, and anything else that caught his fancy. Clara started baking small treats for him, biscuits with sugar sprinkled on top, or apple slices dusted with cinnamon. One day, when Eli proudly showed her a crooked drawing of her standing by the stove, she couldn't help but laugh, a real, light-hearted sound that startled even her. Luke, passing by the door, paused to listen. It had been years since laughter like that had filled his home. Over the next few days, he found reasons to linger in the kitchen more often. Sometimes he'd pretend he needed coffee refilled or ask about the weather, though he already knew the answer. Other times, he simply sat at the table watching Clara move about the kitchen with quiet purpose. The tension in her shoulders had lessened. She still wore her hair neatly tied back, but a few loose strands now framed her face. Her cheeks carried color again. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in streaks of orange and violet, Luke stopped by the fence where Clara was hanging laundry. Eli chased the dog nearby, laughter echoing across the yard. Luke leaned against a post, arms folded. "You've done more good for this place in a few weeks than I've managed in years," he said. Clara smiled faintly, not meeting his eyes. "All I've done is cook and wash clothes." He shook his head. "You've done more than that. You've brought life back to this house. My boy hasn't smiled this much since his mama passed." Her hands stilled on the line. "Your wife? She must have been a kind woman." "She was," Luke said softly. "Strong too, but the good ones usually are." Their eyes met then, and for the briefest moment, something unspoken passed between them. A shared understanding of loss, and the quiet courage it took to live again after it. Clara looked away first, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected kindness like his to feel so dangerous, so gentle. Later that week, the ranch hands began to notice the change as well. Luke smiled more often, laughed a little easier. He'd begun to help Clara with small chores around the house, despite her protests. When he carried in the heavy water buckets or chopped wood for the stove, she would shake her head and murmur, "You don't have to do that." "Mr. Barrett." "I know," he'd answer, a hint of a grin tugging at his mouth. "But I want to." In the evenings after supper, Clara sometimes joined Luke and Eli on the porch. The boy would chatter about the horses, and Luke would sit in his old rocking chair, pipe in hand, his gaze softening every time Clara smiled. She didn't notice how often his eyes found her, or maybe she did and was simply too shy to say so. Each night before bed, Clara would whisper a small prayer of gratitude. Not for grand blessings or riches, but for quiet days, warm food, and the safety she now felt beneath this roof. She'd lived years believing peace wasn't meant for her. Now she was beginning to believe otherwise, and though neither she nor Luke spoke it aloud, both could feel something shifting, something tender and fragile, growing slowly between them, like a seed that had waited a long, long time for spring. The house that had once felt like a tomb of memories now breathed with warmth again. And as the days stretched on, Luke began to realize that the woman who had come to his ranch with nothing but a small bundle of clothes might have brought him something far greater, a reason to hope again. Summer brought long days and golden light, but also the kind of storms that seemed to rise out of nowhere. The sky would darken in the space of a breath, and the wind would roll through the valley like a restless spirit. By late afternoon one day, Luke Barrett could tell the air was shifting again, the stillness before a storm. He'd been out mending a section of fence with 2 ranch hands when he spotted the first gray clouds gathering over the ridge. "Looks like it's coming fast," he said, tightening the last wire. "Get the horses in and secure the barn doors." "I'll finish here." He didn't see Clara watching from the porch, one hand shielding her eyes as the wind began to stir. She'd grown less fearful of storms since that spring night, but they still made her uneasy. Every roll of thunder tugged at old memories she wished she could forget. Inside the house, Eli played quietly near the fire, his drawings scattered across the table. Clara began gathering supplies just in case the power went out. The lanterns, a pot of stew for later, a blanket or two. But when the sky cracked open with a roar, she felt her heartbeat quicken. Luke still hadn't returned. The rain came suddenly, pelting the windows, and the wind howled through the yard. Clara tried to focus on her work, but when she glanced out the window and saw the distant fields, empty, no rider in sight, panic clawed at her chest. "Eli," she said gently, "stay inside, sweetheart. I'll be right back." The boy blinked at her, confused. "Pa said to stay in when it storms." "I know," she whispered, reaching for her shawl. "But your pa's still out there." She pulled the shawl tightly around her shoulders and stepped into the rain. The wind whipped her hair loose and the cold stung her skin. The path to the pasture was a blur of mud and water, but she pressed on, calling his name through the storm. "Luke, Luke!" For a while there was no answer, only thunder and the sound of rushing water in the ditch. Then faintly she heard a groan. She turned toward the sound and saw him, half hidden near a fallen tree branch, his leg pinned beneath it. "Luke!" She dropped to her knees beside him, soaked to the bone. He looked up, dazed but conscious. "Clara, what are you doing out here?" "I came to find you," she said breathlessly, tugging at the branch. It was heavy, but she braced her feet and pushed with all her strength. "You shouldn't have been out here alone." He gave a strained chuckle. "Neither should you." After several desperate tries, the branch shifted enough for him to free his leg. He winced, grimacing in pain. "It's not broken," he muttered, trying to stand. "Lean on me," she insisted, slipping her shoulder beneath his arm. He hesitated for a moment, pride flickering in his eyes, but then nodded, allowing her to help. Together, they limped through the mud toward the house, each step a battle against the wind. When they reached the porch, Clara guided him inside, breathless and trembling. Eli ran to them, crying out in relief. "I'm all right, son," Luke reassured him, pulling the boy close before sinking into a chair by the fire. Clara knelt beside him, inspecting his leg. "It's bruised," she said softly, "but nothing's broken." "You'll be fine." Luke caught her hand before she could pull away. "You shouldn't have come out there," he said again, his voice low. "I couldn't just sit and wait," she whispered, meeting his eyes. "Not when you might have been hurt." For a long moment they held each other's gaze, rain drumming on the roof, the firelight flickering across their faces. In that fragile silence, something unspoken became clear between them. She wasn't just his cook anymore. And he wasn't just her employer. "You saved me, Clara," he said finally. Her lips trembled into a small, tender smile. "No," she murmured, "you saved me first." Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving behind only the soft patter of rain. Inside the warm glow of the kitchen, their hearts had made a different kind of choice. Quiet, certain, and full of promise, the storm passed by morning, leaving the ranch washed clean under a pale golden light. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the world seemed quieter, peaceful, almost reverent, as though even nature had paused to rest. Clara moved softly through the kitchen, setting a kettle on the stove. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair loosely tied, and though she was exhausted from the night before, her heart was full. Every now and then, her eyes drifted toward the porch where Luke Barrett sat with his injured leg propped up, watching Eli chase a chicken across the yard. He looked different that morning, tired but content, as if the storm had swept away more than rain. When Clara brought him coffee, Luke gave her that quiet smile she'd grown to cherish. "You didn't have to make breakfast after a night like that," he said. "I wanted to," she replied softly, setting the cup beside him. "Besides, someone has to make sure you don't hobble out there again before you're healed." He chuckled lowly. "I'll behave, for today." For a while they sat in silence, listening to Eli's laughter mix with the rustle of the wind. Then Luke's voice turned thoughtful. "You know, when you first came here, I thought you'd stay a few days. Maybe a week. You looked so scared that morning, like a bird ready to fly at the first wrong sound." Clara smiled faintly, her gaze on the horizon. "I was scared. I'd lost everything I knew. But this place, it's given me something I didn't think I'd ever have again." "What's that?" "Peace," she said. "And a home." Luke's hand tightened around his mug. "Clara," he began, then paused. Words were hard for him, especially ones that mattered. "I know I ain't easy to be around. And I know you didn't come here looking for any of this. But after last night, after you came out there in that storm..." She turned to him, her eyes wide and warm. waiting. I realized something. He continued quietly. You don't just belong here, you belong with us, with me. If you'll have that. The words hung between them, honest and simple, yet heavy with feeling. Clara's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she could only stare at him. This man who'd once been a stranger, now offering her something she'd never dared hope for again. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand. Luke, I think I already do. He looked up sharply, meeting her eyes. What he saw there, warmth, trust, love, softened the hard lines that grief had carved into his face. He squeezed her hand, and for the first time in years, his heart felt light. Eli came bounding up the steps, cheeks flushed from play. Clara, he called, catching himself shyly. Can we have biscuits with supper? Clara laughed, brushing a strand of hair from his face. If your father behaves, maybe. Luke grinned, pulling Eli into his lap. Hear that, son? I've got to behave. The boy giggled, and the sound filled the porch, pure, bright, and full of promise. Clara looked at them, man and child, and felt something settle deep inside her. Belonging. That evening, as the sun set over the hills, Luke limped into the kitchen while Clara was finishing supper. The light from the window bathed her in gold, and for a long moment he just watched her. You look at peace, he said softly. She turned, smiling. Maybe because I finally am. Luke stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. Then let's keep it that way, he murmured. Together. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted away, leaving the sky clear and endless. Inside, three souls, once broken, now whole, shared a quiet supper that tasted of warmth, love, and home. The widowed rancher had opened his door to a stranger. But in doing so, he'd found not just help for his ranch, he'd found healing for his heart. And for the first time in years, laughter and love filled the Barrett home once more.